Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever it is right now with you. I'm Greg Spin. It's time for another Say What's on Your Mind podcast. This episode is about wealth inequality in America. And you may be experiencing this where you are in the world as well. We're going to talk to Chuck Collins right now, and we'll see what's on his mind.
I'm here to talk with you about this moment that we're in. I would call it a moment of extreme, extraordinary inequality of income, wealth, and opportunity, and what it means and what we can do to reverse it. But I want to say, I think that the discussion about inequality sometimes can be polarized, stuck, and that and even raising the question of, is there a concentration of wealth in this country elicits concerns, or that, I'm going to come out and talk about class warfare, class envy. So let me start by just saying, I grew up in the 1%. My great-grandfather was the meatpacker Oscar Mayer. So my dad used to say, bringing home the bacon means something different in our family. And I still go to our big family reunion where, I put on my lederhosen and stand in front of with a group family picture in front of the Wienermobile with 350 of my closest relatives. So we're still a very, very close-knit family. But I say that because I want you to know I grew up in a bubble of privilege. I grew up in a wealthy suburb of Detroit, Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. I went to a boys' prep school, Cranbrook School. Our school motto was aim high, which is depicted by an archer shooting an arrow straight into the air, which, if you think about it, says it all. One of my older classmates was a guy named Mitt Romney, and he certainly aimed high, I thought, in terms of his aspirations. But that whole socialization, that experience was, to prepare me as a young man, born on third base. I'd won the lottery berth, and I'm going to be prepared to take my place at the head of the table. And that was really the socialization that I grew up with, except for a couple of things. One was we lived next to Detroit. And in 1967, when I was 7 years old, the Detroit uprising, the riots erupted, and my mom, in her great sensibility, when I was pestering her, why is this happening? She said, this has to do with the fact that things are not fair in this city. And I knew, even at 7, what she meant, the gap between city and suburb, rich and poor, black and white. And that planted this little seed in my own understanding. And I really have just looked at the world through that lens of an inequality. An interesting thing happened to me when I was about in my mid-20s. I had a job working with mobile home park tenants who own their mobile homes but did not own the land in their parks. They didn't own their parks. And my job was to help them figure out how to buy their parks and own them as resident-owned cooperatives. And in the process of that, I got to know the intimate financial secrets of hundreds of low-income New Englanders, because I was the one who sat down with everybody in the park and said, what's your savings? What's your income? What can you afford to pay toward the purchase of the park? What can you afford to pay on a monthly basis? And it really gave me, in the mid-'80s, a window into how people were struggling and surviving as real wages started to stagnate and flatten. And for those of you who were around in those days, we really, between the end of World War II into the mid-'70s, we really did live through a period of relative rising tide, lifting all boats. The bottom fifth, the middle, and the top all grew relatively, saw their incomes grow at roughly the same rate. But starting in the late 70s and going into the 80s, real wages started to flatten out. So I had this intimate front row seat into how working people were struggling to survive in the growing unequal economy. But also growing up in a wealthy family, I had an intimate front row seat into the lives of my classmates, of my family and friends who would say things like, we bought that house up north for X and we just sold it for 30X and we bought another house. Or we're invested in a fund that's earning 40% returns. And I sort of had this experience of like seeing wealth creating wealth and what that meant in the lives of people I knew. And it ultimately led me to a radical decision, because I worked with these mobile home tenants in some situations where to buy their parks, they had to come together and put every nickel they had together on the table. And there was something in that process of watching people exhibit an intense solidarity, a commitment to one another, a willingness to be all in for one another, that inspired me. And in a way, I wanted what some of those people had. I wanted that sense of community and reciprocity. And I began to think that maybe this wealth that I had been privileged to receive was an impediment or a barrier to me having the kind of authentic relationships of connection that I wanted. So I made this decision when I was 27 to give away the inheritance. And I won't talk much about that, but I can later if people are interested. But that's just to give you an understanding that when I talk about these issues of inequality, or when I talk about people in the 1%, I'm talking about people I love, people I know, people I respect, many people who I would want to be on my team to solve any civic problem. So I don't hate wealthy people. I actually love some of them very dearly. And I do think we are in a stuck place, and I want to talk about how to move forward. But first, let's just take a look now. What's the picture? 2019. What is the nature of the inequality that we're living with? Well, as I mentioned, for now over 4 decades, real wages, paychecks, have been flat. Half the population has not shared in the economic gains of the last 40 years. They've not shared in the productivity gains since the iPhone and the advent of the internet. And that means there's a lot of people who've been left behind and feel a deep sense of betrayal when it comes to looking around at the prosperity that others enjoy. But the other piece of the story, and that's sometimes left out, is what's happening at the top. There, really, since the economic meltdown of 2008, most of the gains in income and wealth have gone not to the top 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1%. People in the top 1/10 of 1% have incomes over 3 million, wealth over 20 million. Most of their income comes not from wages and salaries. More than half of it comes from owning wealth. The higher up we go up the economic ladder, the more concentrated the income and wealth becomes. The 400 wealthiest people in the United States, all billionaires, their combined wealth is equal to 64% of the population combined, the bottom 64. 400 billionaires, their combined wealth is equal to all the wealth owned by all the African Americans in the United States, plus a third of all the Latinos. 400 billionaires. And 3 billionaires, Bezos, Buffett, and Gates, their combined wealth is equal to the combined wealth of the bottom half of US households. I'm not making this up. The reason that's possible is because there are so many households that have so little. There are 21% of households are what I call part of underwater nation. They have zero or negative wealth. 21%, 1 out of 5 households, zero or negative wealth. 37% of African American households, 33% of Latino households, zero or negative wealth. So that's how it's possible for 3 people to have as much wealth as the bottom 50% of US households.
A lot of great information coming from Chuck there, huh? Well, he has more. Stick around. Let's hear more of what Chuck has to say right now.
We have a extraordinary racial wealth divide, which actually has its own history and dynamics that really goes back to the ultimate disenfranchisement and slavery, Jim Crow, separate but unequal, the legacy of discrimination in wealth building and housing. So today, the median white family has 41 times the wealth of the median black family, and 22 times the wealth of the median Latino family. So that's the picture. That's the picture today, 2019. But as Thomas Piketty said, if we don't intervene in the machinery now, the systemic inequalities that are essentially keeping wages suppressed and funneling wealth to the top, that a generation from now, we will be a society, we will be a hereditary aristocracy of wealth, where the sons and daughters of today's billionaires dominate our politics, our economy, philanthropy, and culture. You may be thinking, aren't we there already? But in fact, we will become more so. That if we don't intervene into these cycles of growing inequality, we will become an economic and racial apartheid society that, in my view, none of us will want to live in. Even those we might think of as the beneficiaries, the most wealthy people, will not want to live in the kind of polarized, calcified, and extremely unequal society that we will become. Do these inequalities matter? When I first started doing this work, people used to debate this point. People would say to me, well, I understand poverty matters, but does it matter how wealthy the wealthy are? I can now tell you, without taking much time, there's now a mountain of research, interdisciplinary research, in every area that shows that the concentration of wealth and power is distorting and undermining everything we care about. It's bad for our health. It's bad for the health of the wealthy. It's bad for our democracy, clearly. When so few people have so much power, it in some ways, I think, explains the election that we lived through 2 years ago. When there's rising economic inequality and insecurity, it gives root to a regressive and progressive populism. So you see the anger and reflection of both, support for Bernie Sanders and a focus here, and Trump and the regressive populism. And regressive populism, why it's the oldest story in the book. It's the history of when things become unequal and unstable, let us shift the focus. Let us scapegoat someone who has less power, less advantage. It's the oldest story in the book. It's the roots and history of anti-Semitism that deflect and blame. But that inequality is what underlies the condition of what we're going through. It has an effect on social cohesion. It supercharges the existing inequalities that exist in terms of gender and race and other differences. It stalls out social mobility. It keeps people in their castes with less mobility. It's even bad for the economy in so many ways. Sometimes I have friends who are entrepreneurs or business people, and they say, I worry about inequality, but I worry about some of the solutions that people are proposing because of the unintended consequences. It might hurt the economy. It might kill the goose that laid the golden egg. And I tell them about my friend Peter Georgescu, the retired CEO of Rubicon and Young, a big ad agency. He's a business leader who is outspoken on these issues of inequality. And Peter says to me, oh yeah, I have a lot of business leader friends of mine that say that too. What I tell them is extreme inequality is killing the goose.
I'm so glad Chuck is sharing what's on his mind, because I'm learning things that I didn't know right now as well. More to come. Stick around. Now let's hear what else is up with Chuck.
So given that a lot of these inequalities arose from systemic problems with policy, how do you convince people to give more money to the government that already created the issues in the beginning, especially in a climate of distrust?
Yeah, a huge barrier to taxation is how people feel about government. That there's no surprise there, and the need to rebuild trust in government. But we have, I think one challenge is we don't really have positive PR for the positive things that government does. There's a lot of things that local government does that people broadly support. The more sort of closeness to people's lives, the better. People feel better about their state governments. When it gets to the national government, that's where things really break down, and that's also where the power imbalances and distortions kick in. So you have this enormous focus on militarization and military budget, and the power of lobbyists to shape public priorities basically disenfranchises the rest of us. But I think the way to move forward are, I call them these game-changing campaigns. A game-changing campaign would reduce the concentration of wealth and power, generate revenue for something big and bold that will make a real difference in people's lives, comes with a constituency willing to fight for it, and changes the narrative or the story around inequality. So I mentioned the students in California, but in Massachusetts we have a millionaire tax initiative. It would raise income taxes on incomes over $1 million. It would generate money for education and public transportation. So there's a constituency that's going to fight for it. And it changes the story about, we're enlisting, just like in California, business leaders who support public transit, graduates from college in the 60s and 70s who got a debt-free college education and are standing up to say the next generations of students should get that. So I think part of how we rebuild government is through a little bit of earmarking, is through a little bit of linking to big things that matter. Debt-free higher education? Yeah, you got a constituency of students and their parents. 40 million households in the United States are carrying some form of student debt. That's a political constituency. The Green New Deal, people who care about the environment and green new job opportunity. That's a constituency that would, make things happen. So I think we need to do things that, we forget. We together through government can do big and bold, powerful things together that will really make the quality of our lives better. That's the hope. And the attack on government, the attack on the tax system, the undermining of the IRS, all these things are an effort to sort of weaken and undermine that. So that's part of our civic job, is to reverse that.
Well, folks, that's going to wrap up this episode of the Say What's on Your Mind podcast. Sure hope you enjoyed that and got some information for yourself there. We would love to have you support this podcast so that we can continue to bring it to you and continue to grow it. You can do that by clicking the link in the description. You can also send a voice message about what's on your mind, and we'll see what we can do to get that on the podcast as well. But definitely could use your financial support. Maybe become a monthly subscriber. You do that right in the link, right in the description. Sure appreciate you, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the Say What's on Your Mind podcast. Have a great one.